Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Disaster Risk Reduction: How Philanthropy Can Empower a Resilient Future. My name is Austin Snowbarger, and I am the Senior Manager of Strategy and Research at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are he, him, his. My initial interest and introduction to disaster risk reduction, our topic for today, came while working for a non-government organization in Haiti, supporting long-term recovery and reconstruction efforts following the 2010 earthquake. I learned that disasters are not natural, and that if we choose, we can prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk. This experience led me to return to school, where I focused on disaster risk and studied capacity development for disaster risk reduction in the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. I have carried these experiences into my other work in the humanitarian and philanthropic sectors, and look forward to discussing this important topic today. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the devastation caused by serious disaster events around the world this very week, including Hurricane Milton, which is disrupting lives and livelihoods as we speak. Our thoughts are with all affected people. We are keeping a close eye on the impacts from this disaster at CDP and how philanthropy can support recovery. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to meet your needs better. And finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on Closed Caption, Live Transcript to access it, and these are available in multiple languages. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Grantmakers for Thriving Youth, Philanthropy New York, the Funders Network, and United Philanthropy Forum. We thank them for their support. As we begin the webinar today, CDP acknowledges it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy, and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders in past, present, and future generations. So what are we going to focus on and cover today in this webinar? At the end of the webinar, donors and listeners will understand the meaning and importance of disaster risk reduction, learn how and why to support disaster risk reduction activities in their grant making and donations, and increase their awareness of the needs and role of children in education and supporting disaster resilience in children. So let's take a look at the results from the poll that you all completed as you entered the webinar today. This helps us gain an understanding of who is in the room today, and helps our speakers know how to target some of their remarks. In terms of familiarity with today's topic, we say 42% of you are somewhat familiar, and so coming in with a bit of a background and understanding of this topic, which is good, and others across the spectrum. So we hope that what we cover today will address your needs and questions. The second question was, if you are a funder, asking about current support for disaster risk reduction. And we have a mixture here, 21% yes and 21% no, so an equal balance there, and a good portion of you that are not funders, and we welcome you as well. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guests. I'm very much looking forward to the information they will share with us today. Lisa Butenhoff is Head of Anticipatory Action at Save the Children. Save the Children's Anticipatory Action Team aims to mitigate the impact of predictable crises on children in their work on emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction, and anticipatory action. Save the Children takes a child and community-centered approach to their anticipatory action work, while mainstreaming anticipation and preparedness into their own systems. Paula Albrito has been the director of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction since 2022. She has served in the United Nations system since 1999. Director Albrito joined the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, in 2004, and has served multiple roles, including UNDRR Regional Coordinator for Europe, the Chief of the UNDRR Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia, and Chief of UNDRR's Intergovernmental Processes, Interagency Cooperation, and Partnership Branch. Welcome to both of you, and thank you again so much for taking time to share your expertise with us. As we begin, I will note that we may use the acronym DRR to refer to disaster risk reduction. We do try to be aware of acronyms and the use of them, but you may hear us use DRR today. Paula, let me start with you. To ground us in this conversation, what is disaster risk reduction, and why should funders be aware of it?
Hosting, a pleasure to be with you and with the rest of you that are connected. Very important question, what is disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction, or DRR, is a process that aims at reducing the risk posed by natural hazards, like earthquakes, storms, or floods. It's really about identifying these risks and taking steps to reduce their impact before they turn into a disaster. And the focus of DRR is on building resilience by preventing disasters that cause widespread destruction and loss of life. We know that the number of affected persons and absolute economic losses from disasters have been steadily increasing. This is something, Austin, that you just opened your conversation with. And our office, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is within the United Nations system the focal point for coordinating global efforts on the topic. We are also the custodian of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, 2015-2030. If you want to know how to reduce risk, look at it. And of course, we monitor its implementation. We work with governments, private sector, scientific sector, and civil society to reduce disaster risk. And our role is really to advocate for risk-informed development, provide guidance on how to become disaster resilient, and build the capacity of countries to manage their risk. The convening of partnership and empower community to be resilient is at the core of our action. Global cooperation is something that we put into practice. We organize global and regional platforms for disaster risk reduction so that we can enhance and share knowledge among different communities. And of course, we support countries in implementing national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction is a critical component of sustainable development. Without it, disasters can really wipe out years and even decades of progress in a matter of a moment. One of the key messages we convey at UNDRR is the incredible return on investment that disaster risk reduction offers. Every dollar spent on risk reduction can save up to 15 in post-disaster recovery costs. So it is a sound financial decision, but most importantly, also a life-saving one. I can give you very succinctly example with the recent flood in Pakistan in 2022. A third of the country was submerged, impacting millions and causing billions of damages. Pakistan is in the need of greater international investments in DRR strategies, such as flood-resistant infrastructure and early warning systems. However, to date, Pakistan has reportedly received only about 1/3 of the pledged international support, which means that the humanitarian needs are increasing in terms of the capacity that we have to respond to the call of countries. As funders, I believe that you have a very unique opportunity to ensure the community are resilient and prepared for these challenges. And by investing in disaster risk reduction, you not only just help to protect life and livelihood today, but you're also ensuring that future generations will inherit a world that is safer, more resilient, and more sustainable. So the role of philanthropy in disaster risk reduction cannot be overstated. And I think that your investments can really fund innovations in early warning system, disaster resilient infrastructure, and of course, community-led preparedness programs to ensure that the vulnerable population can be better protected. So one core message, disaster risk reduction is a vital piece of the puzzle in achieving long-term sustainable development.
Thank you, Paula. I think you made a strong case for the financial incentive and cost savings element, but also the human element in terms of humanity and the lives saved. Thank you for that introduction. Lisa, let me follow up on that with you. What is anticipatory action, and is it different from disaster risk reduction? Also, is anticipatory action different in the United States, for example, than other countries, perhaps? And lastly, can you highlight a couple of successful programs Save the Children has led?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and kind of building off what Paula has been saying. Disaster risk reduction is a really important shift we can make from focusing on disaster impacts to managing the disaster impacts to managing disaster risk. And anticipatory action, disaster risk reduction are part of a broader spectrum of disaster risk management that should be, and anticipatory action is simply a bit more focus on the timing. So we're putting something we're doing now is looking at how we can understand potential impacts before they happen of a particular crisis, and then take action together with communities to prevent those impacts. That's the essence of anticipatory action. And again, it's part of a wider approach to disaster risk management. We know that around 50% of humanitarian crises can be are somewhat predictable, and that 20% are actually highly predictable. And among those, a lot of those are weather and climate related events, and the science is pretty good. It's getting better. And also weather and climate related events are becoming more frequent and extreme. And so where we have a forecast of a hazardous event, be it a flood or a drought or a typhoon, we have a window of opportunity to act ahead of time if we have planning in place with communities to give early warning messages, to support evacuation, to support investments in livelihoods, for instance, ahead of a drought that can mitigate impacts on communities, on children. And of course, we have different windows of opportunity to act. So with a flood, we may have 10 days. With a drought, we may have 3 months. With a hurricane, we may have a few days for it to, in terms of knowing which particular communities may be impacted. And what's important for this are kind of fundamentals of anticipatory action are all key components of disaster risk reduction. So for instance, understanding underlying, the risks and underlying vulnerabilities in communities, how communities are impacted by hazards, and particularly different segments of communities are impacted in different ways. And I'll come on to this later in terms of children. So what can be, in terms of the impacts of disasters, what can be mitigated? Can we help communities to preserve livelihoods, to protect children, to continue education? And what capacities already exist at the community level for, in terms of understanding and monitoring risks that we can build on and supplement and support. Just as an example, Save the Children has programs in many countries. In Sudan, we did a mapping of risk of flooding with several communities, and looked at how they were predicting that flood would happen in the first place, and where were their strengths and gaps in that understanding, how that could be supplemented by climate services and for scientific forecasts. And then together with the community, what actions could they take ahead of time? Could they build up the dikes in the community? Could they store food and livelihood supplies in watertight containers? Could they take action to protect schools? Could they identify evacuation routes? And so we worked with several partners and with communities, and indeed our plan was activated. A 10-day forecast showed a very high likelihood of heavy rainfall, and we understood very well the vulnerabilities at community level. So the community activated this plan. They did disseminated early warning messages. They did training and pre-positioning of supplies, and also shored up the dikes in the community to protect land, and did early harvesting, trained health workers in diseases that could be spread by water and so forth. And communities that were supported ahead of time found a very significant reduction in the perceived damage to shelters, livelihoods, infrastructure. Likewise, just to give a very short example, in Bangladesh, where we have several anticipatory action plans for cyclones, for flooding, for heat waves, for cold waves, starting to do one for landslides now. Earlier this year, there was very extreme heat, which was forecast, and we had plans in place with communities to disseminate messages about how to protect the most vulnerable, particularly children and old people, from heat-related illness. We put in place water points so people could access clean water, and worked with health facilities to raise awareness among children, parents of young children, and that prevented some of the most severe impacts of heat waves in those communities. So lots of different examples, but that's the basics of anticipatory action. But to emphasize, it's very important to see this as a one component in the different ways that we can do disaster risk management.
Yeah, thank you for making a connection of anticipatory action, defining it, and how it connects to disaster risk reduction and the ecosystem in general. One thing that jumped out to me from what you just said, Lisa, was, in an age of changing climate and where there's growing instability, there are still information and knowledge we have that we can predict certain crises, and it's whether we're going to take that information and act on it, right? So thank you for those examples in practice. It's always helpful to tie these concepts to practice. Paula, can you provide, from your perspective and your work, some examples of successful disaster risk reduction interventions?
Absolutely, Austin. And I think these examples are very important, are talking very concretely to why disaster risk reduction is so fundamentally important. In the slide, you would see a number of examples. I will focus on 2 or 3. At the national level, first of all, one important example comes from Mexico City. You might be familiar with the fact that there was a tragic earthquake in 1985 that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Following this painful earthquake, the city took a number of steps to implement stricter building codes and laws. These actions proved to be very effective. When another major earthquake struck in 2017, despite the city's population having grown significantly, the number of fatalities was reduced to over 300. So this remarkable reduction was the direct result of lessons learned from past disasters and applying risk reduction measures leading to improved infrastructure and better risk governance. So in this example, you see national impact and the interface between the infrastructure, how you build your houses, your schools, and where you build them, and of course, the governance of risk, the active engagement of the government in order to ensure that there are going to be law and legislation to ensure that this construction will be indeed resilient. A second case, which I think builds very much on what Lisa was mentioning, comes from Bangladesh. Bangladesh was and has one of the most successful cyclone preparedness programs in the world. Between 1970 and 2022, the country reduced cyclone mortality by around 90%. This success is largely due to a comprehensive early warning system and the construction of a gender-sensitive evacuation shelter. And when the cyclone hit, I don't know if you're familiar with this, it hit in 2007, affected 9 million people, but fewer than 3,500 lives were lost. And this is a big contrast compared to the 300,000 fatalities in a similar storm decades earlier. So the program really focused on community mobilization and timely evacuation, and really has made a tremendous difference in order to save lives. And let me conclude, Austin, with one example that moved to another part of the world, which is Europe, in the Netherlands. Flood risk management is a global model for disaster risk reduction when we see the Netherlands and when we talk about the country. There was a devastating flood in 1953. And from there, the Dutch government invested in the Delta Works, which is basically an extensive system of dams and storm surge barriers that are designed to protect against the rising sea level and flooding. Since the completion of this system, the Netherlands has not experienced any fatalities or important losses from flooding, even though much of the country is below the sea level. So the Delta Works is a testament on how long-term investment in infrastructure can eliminate risk and protect entire populations. And as you can see, the example really varies from countries that will have financial capacity that might be totally different from others. But here the key is taking active steps in order to prevent the risk of a disaster.
Yes, active steps. And I appreciate how you gave examples both in the built environment, but then also in other areas such as early warning systems that happens in both the education information space, but then also in the built environment. Critically important, and you both have already touched on the importance of working with community and ensuring that our work is connected to local groups and civil society and government, something that we at CDP believe in as well and try to communicate to donors in the field more generally. So thank you for those excellent examples. Lisa, this year's theme on International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is on October 13th, just a couple days away, looks at empowering children, especially through education. I know many programs don't consider children to have agency in the disaster risk reduction process. How does Save the Children work with children, and why do you think it's important to fund programs that do so?
Yes, children are fundamentally important to disaster risk reduction. They make up about 30% of the world population, and in some of the most vulnerable countries, they make up 50%. So, for instance, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Niger, and it's important to note, first of all, that children are particularly vulnerable to disasters, both physically. So they're smaller, they are more vulnerable to disease, especially small children, in terms of physical damage related to earthquakes, floods. They are at much higher risk to heat waves, cold waves, and children's bodies are smaller and don't have the same defense as healthy adults, nutrition impacts, and so forth. Furthermore, in a lot of disasters, schools are closed. People may be evacuated to schools, and so they aren't usable as schools, or the schools themselves may be damaged. I saw in Paulo's slide previously the example about investment in schools, keeping schools safe from infrastructure safe from earthquakes. And often in the most vulnerable contexts, children who leave school will not come back. And also families who are impacted by disasters, who lose their livelihoods, may resort to coping mechanisms such as sending kids out to work, early marriage in quite extreme cases, or violence against children as the stress takes a toll on families. So it's really important to think about child specific risks. But children also have a lot of agency. They have a lot of power. They are the next generation. They should have a voice, and they often do have a lot of influence in the community. They've got endless energy, as I can say, with 2 young kids, and they can support disseminating early warning messages. They can support particularly in identifying risks for children. So we were doing, for instance, risk mapping in Sudan, and the kids said, when there's a flood, we're very afraid of snakes. And so one of the actions that we took to prepare for flood was to make sure that we had anti-venom kits in health facilities. And it's important to understand risk from the perspective of vulnerable populations, including children. I mentioned children playing a role in supporting early warning. In some schools where Save the Children works and where our partners work, children play a role in actually monitoring of weather and looking at water levels or with wind gauges. And children can also support communities in practicing preparedness for disaster. So we definitely think children have a right to be protected from disaster, but also have a right to participate in shaping strategies for disaster preparedness, prevention, disaster risk reduction. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. Save the Children particularly has done lots and lots of work, and including largely in support of the Sendai framework in the past year since it's come out, on keeping schools safe from disaster. And that can be at an infrastructure level, so securing school structures, but also, as I said, in supporting children's role in processes that are consider both children's needs, but children's agency in disaster risk reduction. So it is really important, in summary, to include children as a population, but not just to consider their vulnerability, but what they have to offer in the DRR space.
Yes, thank you. I love that perspective of being honest about the vulnerabilities, but then also not stopping there and going through to maximize children's wonderful creativity and all their perspective that they can bring to strengthen this work. That's amazing. Lisa, let me stay with you then. CDP's research from our State of Disaster Philanthropy report shows that institutional funders typically put around 50% into immediate response, 10% or so into long-term recovery, and just a fraction into preparedness, risk reduction, adaptation. How should funders divide funds between the different phases of a disaster?
Yes, it's true that there's strikingly little investment in disaster risk reduction, even though Paula shared in her first slide that the $1 investment pays off with 15. And while there are a lot of different figures also about anticipatory action, I think that there's a very strong evidence base for the cost benefit. But then there are also these non-financial benefits that are really important to consider. So we know that we can save lives, livelihoods. We can preserve development gains through disaster risk reduction, anticipatory action, and you save communities and children the stress of going through a disaster. So it's a much more dignified approach to aid, when we can sit beforehand and think about risks and how to mitigate them both in the long run and immediately before a disaster hits. People feel more in control, and that we have more space to work with communities before a disaster than afterwards. So we can't mitigate all of the impacts of disaster through disaster risk reduction and anticipatory action, but we can mitigate a lot of them, and there's a lot that we aren't doing. So this is the important message. But we still see that there has not been, despite even all of the buzz recently around anticipatory action, the investment is still quite small. There's, I think, less than 1% of funding for a pre-crisis response in a report that just came out a few days ago. There are some good investments, so some humanitarian donors committing a percentage of funding to anticipatory action. There are some fantastic pledges. There's a Getting Ahead of Disasters charter that was launched last year at COP28. But I think donors should consider that it's funding evidence-based policies and practices that we know work. On the one hand, we know that disaster risk reduction pays off. Secondly, there's enormous space to integrate disaster risk reduction into all kinds of programming. And we've really seen this in Save the Children from an education perspective, where we aim to make all of our education programming very risk-informed and consider risks from all angles when we're programming as an integral part of what we do in that space. So I think taking a risk, looking at all investments with a risk-informed approach, you can see opportunities within that, and remembering the payoff at the end. I also think that donors can be investing more in evidence and advocacy around disaster risk reduction. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Austin.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the dignified approach. There's something that we can do better, and so we should be doing it in order to have a more dignified approach. Thank you. And a lot of great examples of how funders and philanthropy can get involved to hopefully start to turn those numbers from very small numbers into more significant investments. We will move to the question and answer session after this next question. So just a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have not already done so. Paula, let's wrap up with one more question for you before we move to that question and answer session. What advice do you have for a funder who maybe has never worked in disaster risk reduction before? How could they start incorporating this into their grant making and work?
Austin, this is a fantastic question after what Lisa has laid out as a possibility really to further invest in prevention and disaster risk reduction. I would recommend to start by identifying key partners on the ground. This could be the local NGO, the community organizations, or governmental agency who are already engaged in disaster risk reduction activities. These partners often have the local knowledge and experience to help and guide your initial investment. And also, working alongside with them ensures that your funding is not only effective, but tailored for the unique risk and needs of that community that you choose to support. A practical way to start incorporating disaster risk reduction into grant making is by integrating risk reduction into projects that you are already funding. For example, if you're supporting infrastructure projects, you really want to look into how those infrastructure projects are resilient to disasters. For instance, you might be looking at funding flood resilient infrastructure or incorporating early warning system into the community health or education initiatives. So these are really steps that are going to be accompanying your action with something that will make your work even more resilient and therefore sustainable. Partnership with organizations like UNDRR is also helpful from the early stages, because we provide normative and technical expertise, but also capacity building. So we can really provide a mixture of what is needed in terms of guidance, but also the support of some best practices so that you can work on what has already proven to be helpful in terms of disaster risk reduction. And one important element is that we do have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So we really want to align our actions in building resilience to disasters with the Sendai framework so that we ensure that we are maximizing our efforts. I really believe that you as investors, as philanthropy, have a unique role in disaster risk reduction, because you have the flexibility to fund innovation and pilot projects that can later be scaled by governments or by other international agencies. For example, philanthropic funding can support the testing of new technology that can then really allow for a larger scale implementation of disaster resilience initiatives. So I think that this innovative element and flexibility opportunities that you have is something that we really need in the disaster risk reduction agenda. And let me close with one quote, and I think I'm quoting Jim Carroll on think big, start small, and scale fast. And this is how I would see working with you and all the community. We are thinking big in terms of systemic approach to risk reduction. We've been touching base upon the different sectors that need to be engaged. They will create opportunity for a resilient development. We need to start always with pilots to see whether it works and how it can be adjusted. And with your innovative approach and using our platform of knowledge and actors, we can really scale fast. So I believe that philanthropy thinks of the future and looks at future generations. So following up from the Pact for the Future, we can really work together to navigate and evolving the risk landscape that will really strengthen the global disaster resilience well beyond 2030.
Thank you. Brilliant points. I feel after every time you both contribute something, there's so many nuggets and pieces of information that I want to comment on and dive deeper in. I'll just give a shout out to UNDRR. I've used their resources in my own work, and so I encourage you to check those out. And Tanya, if you could throw in a link to the Sendai framework for people easy access, if you have not already done so, that'd be wonderful. And just to echo your really excellent point, Paula, of the role of philanthropy, and we see that as well, given the different time horizons in which philanthropy can operate and the flexibility that's inherent to our work, we really are uniquely positioned and have a comparative advantage to maximize our impact through investments in areas such as disaster risk reduction. So we cannot say and highlight that enough. All right, so we have received several questions in advance, which is fantastic. I think it shows the interest in the topic and the recognition of how important it is. I'll be working through that list as well as some that have been coming in through the question and answer box during this webinar. As a reminder to everyone, CDP webinars are aimed at providing education for the philanthropic community. And so while all are welcome to pose a question, we will first focus on those addressing some funder issues. Let's see, why don't we start with, there's a couple of questions related to a question here, and maybe I'll start, Paula, with you with this. There's a couple related to this, but this is one question. What is the best way to motivate the donation or the collection of resources for disaster risk reduction? We've talked about a little bit the financial case, the humanity element. How would you respond to that question? How can we motivate donors, and what have you seen worked?
It is a very challenging question, because we have been highlighting the challenge of disasters that is increasing. And I would say that probably the highest incentive for the donors at the time being should be in twofold. One is really seeing through disaster risk reduction the possibility of reducing all the damages and all the humanitarian needs that at the moment we are not able to provide. And on the other hand, ensuring that when we engage into the preventive measures and the preventive agenda, we are able to share the stories on how and what has worked. You gave me the opportunity to tell you about Mexico City, for instance. The reality is that very often having the story of something that did not happen, a disaster that did not happen, being picked up, whether it is by the media or whether it is by donor interest, is challenging. So finding a way for us to be able to best provide this example and trigger the donor on the opportunity to really create a future that is resilient to disasters, therefore sustainable, remains really a recipe that I think we are still to see the full dividend, but we believe that it is really going towards the right direction.
Thank you. Lisa, is there anything you would like to add to that question?
I would agree that it's maybe another incentive now, particularly, is the climate crisis, because it's sort of first and foremost in everyone's minds, and it's become less of a theoretical something than something that is really starting to strike home. So this has been one angle that we use internally to, and it's something we can speak to some of the statistics about increasing frequency and intensity of disasters, and increasingly people in all places in the world are seeing the impacts on communities.
Thank you. I'm looking through the questions in the Q&A box, and I just want to lift up a comment from Holly Jordan, who said she loved, Lisa, your comment on the non-financial benefits of DRR, and it also includes physical but also mental health. And I was just reminded today that today is World Mental Health Day, and so it's a timely comment and reflection, so thank you for that, Holly, and just remembering the physical infrastructure and the impacts, but then also the things that maybe we don't always see as well. Lisa, here is a question for you regarding anticipatory action that we received in advance. In a constrained funding environment, what are the unique funding mechanisms for anticipatory action that international non-government organizations can explore?
Sure. Well, first of all, anticipatory action, as I mentioned, it builds off of a lot of the fundamentals that should be already existing within a disaster risk management strategy, including at a government level. So I'm not just speaking about what happens in the humanitarian community, including early warning systems and risk mapping and systems for forecasting and preparedness systems. As NGOs, the funding is extraordinarily limited for anticipatory action. There's a lot of emphasis on it these days, but of the anticipatory action funding that is out there, I think only about 5% is going to non-governmental organizations. And one of the constraints is that if you're trying to act ahead of a crisis and you want to put a relatively large amount of resources into that, with the project funding model that many non-governmental organizations have, if we're waiting to act ahead of a 1 in 5 year event and we have a 2-year program, that might not be feasible within a typical project. So a lot of the resources that are out there that seem to be more effective for anticipatory action are global, pooled. I mean, and UN, of course, has global pools, and that's why a lot of anticipatory action work is happening through the UN. Also, looking to mechanisms which wouldn't necessarily, which NGOs could support, like social protection systems that could be anticipatory. The START Network is an NGO network that has done a lot of great work on anticipatory action. They have a START fund, which is available for kind of anticipatory activation. And also in some cases, they've put together a risk financing system in particular countries that can be activated with more formalized plans. And these and risk financing is an interesting opportunity. That's not just insurance, but also pooled risk mechanisms. Save the Children uses annually about 10 to 15% of our humanitarian fund for anticipatory action and risk-informed preparedness. And last year, that was about $12 million that went to, I think it was 59 countries where we were foreseeing an emergency and acting ahead of it. So it's challenging. I think what I would recommend to NGOs in this space is to advocate with donors and look for ways to build anticipatory components into programming, and particularly to look at what's possible with collective efforts. And a key important part here is looking at how we can support national disaster management authorities in their efforts. How can we support climate forecasters, including national meteorological agencies and their efforts? Those supporting agencies is not necessarily an expensive, something very expensive, but it can have big payoffs if we're aligning plans, particularly at a national level.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A chat regarding relocation, which I know in other parts of the world, and including here in the United States, is a sensitive topic when we talk about managed retreat and other terms like that. How much of disaster risk reduction focuses on relocation? The comment here is that while relocation is not suited everywhere in every context, to rebuild or rely on early warning systems and evacuations could be unjust. Do one of you want to take on the question related to the connection between relocation and disaster risk reduction activities?
Well, certainly, if I may, Lisa, start with my reflection. I think that the disaster risk reduction component can again prevent, in many cases, relocation. What we see is that relocation comes as an after action, and very often it comes as an action that can save your life. But if you look at the way in which you can really prevent the risk itself, you're going to be reducing the need to relocate and the need also to move countries, or to be an internally displaced person, which is something that, especially with the climate crisis, we're seeing more and more coming into the picture. So I think that the two elements have a potential to work together with positive benefits. Reality is that at the moment, both the elements of relocation and the elements of displacement is becoming a more frequent and current reality. I think that it requires opportunity and engagement that goes well beyond government in terms of different actors and stakeholders that can support these initiatives. And I also believe that, especially in the context of displacement and the experience that I had in Africa, for instance, people clearly and genuinely want to return to their places where they had to leave and evacuate. And I think the opportunity of really working with them, understand together what are the risks in that particular area, so that they can best see which one is the best choice for them on where to be relocated in the same area or in an area that is not exactly the same, is an important conversation that needs to take place. Otherwise, you're going to have not only a lot of pain and frustration, but also a feeling of incapacity to be able to address your life and the direction of your life. So I think this is a focus where we need to work more, but certainly is where there are a lot of interactions between decisions and behavior of people that need to be nurtured with the understanding of the risk around you.
Yeah, thank you for those observations and contributions. Lisa, maybe I can hand this question to you. There's a handful of questions related to understanding why people or communities maybe do not prepare enough for disasters, or why they do not take action. I think a theme that I've heard today in your comment, both of your comments, is we know what to do. There's an evidence base, and it requires funding and it requires action. So what are some reasons that, from your perspective as an implementing or operational organization, given your connection to community, what are some key reasons that people or communities maybe do not prepare for disasters or focus as much on that anticipatory piece?
Yeah, really interesting, because you asked me at the beginning and I forgot to answer. It's whether these concepts are different in the US than elsewhere. And I was just reading an article yesterday about migrant communities in the US and how certain parts of early warning weren't accessible to them. They didn't have plans in place. And I think what's important to note is that not everyone has equal access, and not all places. And Paula could say lots about this with the Early Warning for All initiative. There's in some places there is very low coverage of early warning information and systems, and it particularly for vulnerable and excluded groups, this is a massive issue, both in terms of wider populations and segments within populations. So in order for plans and early warning systems to work, they need to be timely, they need to be relevant, they need to be accurate, and a lot of times those things don't come together. So you may have groups that, if early warnings, for instance, are disseminated via cell phone, can't access it, or you may have a severe distrust of the authorities that are issuing the information, or you may have women with less access, for instance, to written information if there's a high degree of illiteracy, or children not able to access information. And furthermore, you may have messages that are not actually tailored to the particular vulnerabilities and what people need to know. Are they getting the right messages? And there's been really interesting work, for instance, in dense urban communities on, what do people need to know when there's a flood, and how are, people over here in this quite well-to-do neighborhood differentially impacted because the infrastructure is different, or the working schedules are different, or any number of things. So I think it's really important to understand marginalization and vulnerability and how that interacts with access to disaster risk management systems, and that some populations will need more support in getting that access, though they have the same rights to it. And we see that in terms of children, children are particularly affected by disaster, and disabled children, for instance, yet there are very few processes attuned to the needs of disabled children as disabled people generally. And likewise, indigenous populations typically would have less access to services and infrastructure. So it's not that people don't want to prepare for disaster. Sometimes, and then maybe one more is that the resources. So some families, and I think this is felt very much in the US, have the wherewithal to evacuate, to stock supplies, and take time to prepare, and some do not. And so this should be a big focus of our, when we think about disaster risk reduction. And this is the big focus of Save the Children's approach, is those communities that are excluded.
Yeah, thank you for that really thorough response. I want to get to this question, which I think is an interesting one in the Q&A box. How can you make the case A lot of our questions have been around like making the case for something. How can you make the case for linking climate crisis and the humanitarian sector to funders? It appears the current structure keeps those separate. How can we make the bridge? How can we connect? And I think for those of us that have worked in the sector, we understand the historic, at least, if not the current reality of some of those silos. But with the changing climate and the climate crisis and the humanitarian sector, what do we do? Paula, do you have any reflections on that?
It's a very important question, and as you said, Austin, for people that have been working in disaster risk reduction and or on the climate agenda, we see that the convergence is needed. The convergence is needed because, first of all, very often we see at the national level that resources in order to address climate issues and disaster risk reduction are completely separate, which creates overlapping when we're talking about adaptation, but also it avoids using the little capacity that we have in countries to really maximize the impact. What we advocate for is a comprehensive disaster risk management approach that really allows to build on the elements that are related to climate vulnerability and associate the possibility of implementing preventive actions that are talking very much towards the adaptation element or equation of the climate emergency. One element that is very clear, and we are now discussing disaster risk reduction, but we see it across different agendas, is the fact that we're working in silos. And the possibility of breaking these silos between different line ministers, between different actors and sectors, it will be one of the most beneficial approach in order to ensure that we are connecting the dots and that we are using this possibility. We do have some good stories. If you take the small islands development states, they are challenged by climate change enormously. It really is a survival challenge for them. At the same time, they have little capacities and they are small island development states. And what we've seen is that very often the possibility for governments to work together with different actors in strategies, national strategies that include disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation is a winning one. And it's really providing the opportunity for these governments to be able also to have a longer time perspective on the topic of building resilience to climate disasters. So these are some of the elements that I will bring to the table. But whoever asked the question, it is an extremely important one. And I would encourage all of us really to start connecting these different elements, this different agenda, because whatever we are discussing is systemic. It's going to be touching and interfering upon the different sectors, upon the different communities, and therefore coming together in order to tackle it will really be the winning card.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, that we can't do this alone. We need each other, and let's take individual responsibility and initiate contact and collaboration with other sectors and partners. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. I know there's many more questions, and I would love to spend many more hours with Lisa and Paula discussing them, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and we need to allow them to get on with their evenings as well. But as we begin to wrap up, I want to provide the audience with some actionable thoughts from our conversation. Build risk reduction funding into your disaster grants. When you fund in the relief and response phase or in recovery and reconstruction, think about the future. What can your funding do to reduce future disaster risk? CDP recently saw success when 2 housing projects we funded in South Louisiana suffered no damage because of resilient construction. Recognize that children and youth have agency and autonomy. Children and youth aren't always considered as people with ideas and suggestions for disaster risk reduction, but they are experts in their own lives and experiences. So let's involve them in planning and listen to their ideas. Natural hazards are inevitable. Disasters don't have to be. We know that there will be more natural hazards, but we also know that disasters only occur when these intersect with vulnerability. By reducing risk, we can transform what it means for a community to be affected by a natural hazard and create opportunities to avoid disasters. Another good resource is disastersavoided.org for more information. CDP has lots of information to help you learn more, including our weekly disaster blog, profiles, and issue insights. We also have educational resources, including special reports, the Disaster Philanthropy Playbook, and of course, our webinar series. We have several funds as well with a focus on long-term equitable recovery, and many of those funds also touch on disaster risk reduction. If you want to explore further, our expert advisory service team provides customized assistance to donors of all kinds. Please save the date. We will be hosting a webinar on October 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern to talk about Hurricane Milton and other recent disasters. So please watch our website and social media for more details about that event. Our final regularly scheduled webinar this year will be on November 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and it is called Imagining 2025, What's Next for Disaster Philanthropy, and features a fireside chat between philanthropy futurist Trista Harris, CEO of Future Good, and our own Brenda Camacho, Chief Financial and Operations Officer. In order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you to our co-sponsors and especially to Lisa and Paula for taking the time to share their insights with us. Please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinar events. It will pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon or evening or morning.